Hi, everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk Risk, where our goal is to connect, engage, and inspire each other and build a global community of risk practitioners. I'm your host, Naveen Agarwal, and today I'm super excited to welcome my guest, Charles Mauro. He's the founder and president of Mauro Usability Science and UX Optimization, and he is a legend in this field. With over 3,000 projects under his belt, he was named the Titan of the industry for human factors research. He has helped clients such as Nike, Dyson, Apple, Microsoft, Pfizer, and Merck. Amazing diversity and range of projects he has done. So I can't wait to just talk to Charles about his experiences and insights. With that, Charles, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Great, thank you.
Well, Charles, I want to start by asking you, you have been in this field for such a long time. I want to start by asking you, what got you started in this field? What got you interested?
Well, I started actually in the field of industrial design. I have a BS undergraduate in industrial design. I worked for a couple of famous industrial designers, Henry Dreyfuss and Raymond Loewy. In the Dreyfuss firm, they were sort of the first design firm to get involved in formal ergonomics, and I worked in that group for a couple of years. And then I realized that I wanted to study professional human factors engineering. So I applied for a graduate program at NYU at New York University, and I was accepted in that program. I studied and obtained a human factors engineering graduate degree, studied in a medical school there for about 3 years. It was a special government program funded under NIOSH. And from that point in 1975 going forward, I founded my own firm, and we just had our 50th anniversary last month.
Congratulations. So as you look back, Charles, can you pick up maybe a couple of examples from your vast experience that were particularly interesting to you from a interesting and maybe even challenging to you from a human factors point of view? Can you share a couple of those examples?
Sure. Well, maybe we'll start with medical devices. One of the most interesting problems that manufacturers of medical devices face today is the sort of general lack of common definition of what actually is human factors engineering in terms of skill set. So we understand, my firm, as we go out into industry, especially these days, corporations that are doing these types of devices, designing them and putting them through into the marketplace, oftentimes they're not clear what skill set is required, and it causes a great deal of confusion. So when we're asked to conduct, for example, FDA focused usability testing on products, either formative or summative studies, we oftentimes run into problems related to management's willingness to understand that human factors is actually a form of science. It's not really an art. And some of the problems that we've been faced with over the last, say, 7 years or so, specifically in our firm, has been related to the measurement and quantification of much more engineering-based types of specifications for medical devices, like, for example, Newtonian force or 3D spatial tracking. Those are two specialized methodologies that one would only obtain through a professional human engineering firm. And for example, on Newtonian force, there's a great deal of concern today about the activation forces, for example, on PFS devices or auto injectors, different types of devices that are going to be delivering large molecule drugs. So these are all, new formulations of drugs are essentially large molecules. So that increases the viscosity of the drug, and it increases the problems related to human factors engineering delivery of the drug by patients specifically. So one of the most interesting problems is looking at, for example, what FDA guidance suggests under HE 75 should be the Newtonian force, for example, for activation of these certain types of devices. And when you actually look at that criteria, I think it's around 20 newtons for a PFS, for example, you realize that very quickly that there's absolutely no research behind those specifications. And so what we've been doing over the last 5 years or so is designing and executing studies for clients where we actually measure the Newtonian force on a range of patients. And the other probably an even more interesting problem is that even the FDA doesn't really properly define what the statistical range of the population should be that the device should be designed for. So many engineers and manufacturers often think that you design a device, for example, for for the mean or the average. But of course, human factors science dictates that you would design for the 2.5 or fifth percentile female. And we actually written a paper on this where we criticized the FDA for this specific problem related to the improper specification of force, for example. So that's
Yeah.
the kind of difficult problem, but in other industries, there are different problems.
Yes, yes, for sure. So, you work for Apple, and when it comes to Apple devices, it's in some ways magic in the hands of the end user. It's so intuitive, it's so easy. And that's part of the reason why Apple has been so successful. Is it possible for you to just share something from your work that you might have done in the electronics industry or more consumer-facing industry that stands out to you?
Sure. Well, I can't share specific projects, but it's interesting to bring up Apple. If you actually look at Apple devices, and we've tested them for Apple, and we've also tested Apple devices extensively for other clients in competitive studies. And actually, what you find when you do a more execute a more professional human factors research study of Apple devices, what you actually find is that they're extremely usable on what's called the FUE, which is the first user experience. That's 0 to first 20 minutes or so. But if you take an Apple device and you push it further in terms of its functionality, like for example, a good representative sample would be, setting up a small work group calendar using iCal. That process itself is as complex, if not more complex, than Android or Microsoft or other operating systems. So what Apple has done brilliantly is that they've leveraged the first user experience and they've made that portion of the user's engagement with the device incredibly intuitive and easy. But once you actually migrate deeper into the user experience, you find these products are actually quite complex. What is that, done to leverage human factors science, to their advantage and produce such a tremendously effective market dominance? And that is they've employed what in human factors science is called transfer learning. So if you now go into an Apple store, you'll see that an iPhone behaves like an iPad, which behaves like an Apple Watch, which behaves like an iMac. It's this transfer of core skills across all of their hardware platforms that creates this extremely high level of engagement at the point of purchase. That's really where they are truly unsurpassed in their application of human factor science.
So in a way, they're trying to build habits, right? They're trying to build some habits among their customers and consumers to interact with Apple devices in a certain way. That's brilliant. I found that very interesting. So Charles, we already have some questions coming in from the audience, and I want to make sure we address those.
Sure, go right ahead.
Bijan is asking, I'm interested to know how Charles thinks the risk acceptability criteria due to use errors should be determined. Can you think about like a method or a framework to figure out acceptability criteria?
Yeah, great question. Excellent question. In fact, today it's really kind of a black art, and I'll give you an example of what I mean. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, we do a significant number of summative studies for FDA approval. And in these studies, we identify use errors through usability testing. And we categorize these errors according to the standard FDA framework. What we do is submit an expert report to the client with all of the related files, the video files, and the risk analysis tables. And then sometimes something happens that's kind of unusual, and that is we'll see these products submitted to the FDA, the same products that we tested utilizing our data, and the data doesn't look the same any longer. And so what happens is that there's a very clear disconnect between the human factors engineering documentation of use errors and what the FMEA or the risk assessment team within the medical manufacturers apply to their interpretation of what is a suitable use error risk. So it's the risk teams we find in some cases, and this is probably not surprising to those of you on the call who actually do this kind of work. The risk teams are driven essentially by an engineering framework. They're not driven by a human engineering framework. So what they will do is they will pull out respondents or they'll pull out use errors which they feel were due to device malfunction, or they may pull out respondents from studies who they feel were inappropriate respondents for some psychophysical reason. So the answer to the question is really not a simple one. The best answer is to start human factors engineering research early in product development. So having the opportunity to execute a applied cognitive task analysis, ACTA, work through the task analysis, work through your use errors in the concept phase of the product. And when you do that, you will find that the use errors that you observe in both formative and summative studies are dramatically reduced and entirely manageable. So my answer to the question would be the best methodology is to utilize professional human factors in development.
But as a follow up to that, I think we are very curious to learn when would you decide that the risk of certain use errors because of human factors issues is acceptable? Like how far do you need to go? And is there a method to deciding those acceptability criteria?
Well, we follow the FDA framework in that context, and any use there that directly impacts drug delivery is essentially what that's in a simplified statement. That's essentially what we categorize as a non-acceptable use error. In fact, when you're conducting human factors engineering research, and you're using the proper percentile distribution, the 2.5 percentile, the fifth percentile, in terms of biomechanical, physical, and cognitive capabilities, you find that many devices that pass FDA human factors engineering review simply are not acceptable when they reach the marketplace. And you can see this validation in the complaint data that comes in for FDA approved devices with respect to human engineering performance. So it's not like we don't know these problems are there. It's very, very difficult to get industry and the FDA to work together to provide a robust definition of how to define the user profiles and what objectively defines use errors.
Got you. So, Charles, we have a comment and a question from Shannon Hosty here. Shannon, nice to see you. Thanks for joining today. She's saying, Charles, I have always appreciated your work on quantitative measurement methods on human performance and usability. Could you share some of your learnings on this? For example, measurement of critical aspects of injection, angle, depth, etc.
Yeah. Hi, Shannon. How are you? Anyone who doesn't know Shannon, she's a wonderful human factors expert and actually worked at the FDA. Yeah, the more robust methods that we use today are, as I said, 3D spatial tracking. For example, we can, utilizing magnetic field interruption and some other technologies, we can interface a very, very small sensor, about the size of a grain of rice, into almost any medical device. And it gives us the opportunity to track the device at the sub-millimeter level in 3D space. So if you're looking, for example, at PFS injection quality or reliability, we can get the angle of injection, we can get the rate of injection, we can get the rate of transfer of the device as the respondent is handling the device. We can get plunger travel, drug delivery travel. We can get Newtonian force on the plunger. So those types of methodologies, we've now got to the point where they're integrated into a standardized platform that we validated. And those we can use to very accurately determine the actual performance of drug delivery devices when in the hands of the users.
Nice. So there is a whole body of science and knowledge that exists out there, which I think we should start applying in our own medical device industry. So with that, thank you so much about it, Charles. Now I have another question from Ronald Baumans. And Ronald, again, thank you for joining. We have talked in the past and you have been a guest here, so it's good to see you. You were asking, is there a difference in acceptability of use risks between FDA and EU requirements? It sounds like a little bit more of a regulatory question, but take it, Charles, and share your perspective on that if you can.
Sure. Yes, Ronald. There is absolutely a difference, but that's really not my specific field of expertise in the firm these days. I have an employee who's an expert in regulatory, so if he was here, I would defer to him. What I would say that over many years of experience working both in the EU and the US, I think there's also a significant attitude difference between the FDA and the EU. We've found that EU regulators tend to be more open, easier to deal with sometimes, and they have very specific methods for proffering recommendations. Sometimes at the FDA, I'm sure many on the call know this, the human factors engineering folks that work for the FDA, many of them do not actually have a formal background in human factors. They may have a background in engineering, risk management, and as a result, sometimes our clients will submit a product for review and we'll get back the most puzzling recommendations because sometimes the FDA individuals or auditors don't have a robust background in human factors engineering. And this is really a big problem in instructions for use, where we'll get instructions for use marked up with requested changes that when we do eye tracking and microfacial expression analysis testing on the IFUs, they make no sense. So That's just
Yeah.
kind of a sidebar.
Well, that's great. So, Charles, I do have a question for you when we were talking about these use requirements and users. Is there a way to look at the situation differently when it's a trained physician as an end user versus, let's say, a layperson or a common person or consumer end user? Because in our industry, we have devices that actually used by patients directly, and there are devices which are used by heavily trained physicians. Is there a way to look at them differently?
Oh, yes. Great question. Very important to understand your actual user profile effectively. And to anyone else on the call who's a professional human factors expert and does usability studies, the actual physicians, nurses, pharmacists are the worst for reading instructions for use. You can predict their behavior from the time in which they come in the lab and they first pick up the device. Generally speaking, unless they're prompted to do so, the last thing they will tend to do is read the instructions for use. So that particular profile must be analyzed from a different point of view than, say, a normal patient or a patient with an extreme clinical condition. So, yes, the different backgrounds of the users in studies have a very important and profound impact on how use errors are rated and how they're captured.
Yeah, you make a good point because I did come across a study where there was a relation between, errors in the operating room and really the gap between the ability to see this IFUs and follow instructions. So, in fact, there is a lot of conversation going on in the clinical practice to improve the safety of the operation. And if I can remember and find that link for the study, I'll share that in the show notes with everybody. So let's continue our conversation, guys. I want to invite you to share your thoughts and comments. We still have plenty of time left. And I think this is a once in a lifetime opportunity with a leader like Charles in this field to ask some more questions. So I encourage you to keep them coming. And also, by the way, it doesn't have to be a question. What is your perspective? What have you come across in your practice that has sort of stood out to you? What best practices you have learned that you want to share? And you can keep sharing those in the comments in the chat. So, Charles, let's continue. I wanna pick up where we left on this paper you talked about designing for extreme percentiles. Now, some might say, wouldn't that lead to over designing and over engineering a product? Can you share some thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, as anyone who deals with human variability as a formal discipline, we know that in terms of strength, cognitive capability, most dimensions of human performance tend to be normally distributed. So when you look at human factors engineering best practices, those best practices dictate that you design for the least capable. And in the field of human factors engineering, we categorize users as LCUs, which is the least competent user, ACU, average competent user, or the MCU, the most competent user. And when we do usability studies, we target the LCU because if you design for the LCU, you're going to capture the rest of the distribution, 2.5 or 5th percentile. Now, does this lead to over design? Generally speaking, no, it does not if you've considered human factors engineering in the development of the product, the device to start off with. Now, one of the reasons that the vast majority of summative studies that get submitted to the FDA never specify what percentile of the devices covers. They don't even, teams that are doing this type of research today, for the most part, don't even take into account the actual user percentile distribution of those who have undertaken the study. So that's why you see errors in the marketplace after these devices have been brought into the market and used by actual patients.
Mhm.
So that's can it lead to over design? Possibly, but it never leads to over design if you use human factors research earlier in development.
Yeah, I think to that we have some supporting evidence from other industries too, right? To some extent, let's go back to Apple again. Of course, very sophisticated design behind the scenes. I don't know what it takes, but these products are very viable and commercially available. They are very nice. People fall in love with them. They work. They don't break down. So this issue of over design might be not very valid if we do it right, and especially if we bring it early. I think that's a very valid. So
Let me just elaborate on that. That's a really interesting point that you bring up about Apple because most folks don't realize this, but Apple does virtually no exterior consumer testing of their products. They use their own employees entirely for usability testing. And this has the quality of the product in the marketplace. As long as you're staying within their domain of their existing GUI or their, the way their products are designed, you're fine. But when you get into a new product like the Vision Pro, their headset, that product came to the marketplace with profound human factors engineering defects.
Mm-hmm.
And did that happen as a result of their narrow approach to consumer testing? Maybe, maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
But that's an example where you would think that Apple is utilizing best practices, but again, the distribution of users that they're exposing the products to relatively
Mm-hmm.
narrow employees.
So there's a watch out here, like don't be overconfident. Don't be overconfident. Great. So Charles, we have a comment here from Bijan. What you said about clinicians not reading the IFUs, he's saying that unless a device is so intuitive that in the summative studies almost no one makes an error, training should be mandatory. What do you think? And should that be a responsibility of the manufacturer?
Yeah, wow, great question. The problem with the design and measuring the effectiveness of IFUs. In fact, we wrote a second paper which we sent to the FDA on this, criticizing the recent IFU guidelines, as was last year submitted by the FDA. The relationship between instructions for use and the device and use errors is complex and difficult. And I would just point out one of the most interesting factors is that there's actually no reliable science for how to design an IFU for minimum errors. It's really thought of by manufacturers as mostly a graphic design problem, but in human factors science terms, it's what we call a function allocation problem. And to do a project, to design a project effectively where you combine instructions for use with a device, you have to start quite early and you allocate those functions through the design of the device that human information processing can manage, and those which they cannot, you allocate to the IFU. So there's a different kind of testing that goes through this process effectively, where you would essentially test the self-evident attributes of the device. How self-evident is it without its IFU? And then you would allocate the functions that are not self-evident to the design of the IFU, and you would test them accordingly. Almost all IFUs are designed that way today. So they're all sort of afterthoughts.
Okay, and I think that if we consider training as mandatory being like a potential risk control measures, I would say we will have to identify that as a measure and see how effective it is. And we know that even after we train them once, they may not be able to continue. So we have a lot of good questions and comments coming in. I want to give them some highlights here. Ronald, you are sharing that in 1988, you were involved in designing an innovative device. You identified 5 different patient groups and interviewed individuals representing those groups. Basically, you did all this work early on. You used non-functioning markups to let them handle the product. This worked very well. So thank you for sharing that. The idea here is do something and do something early. Shannon, you are saying that some of the difference in the industry, Apple and consumer tech know that UX is a value proposition and not just safety. It is part of the core design process principles. In healthcare, it has been forced into the design process. And I'm not sure we have as of yet made UX HF a core design element. That's a great point. Say a little bit more about that, Charles. How can we encourage that? I think that's a sort of a mindset, a business mindset and a strategy topic. How can we encourage that conversation inside our organizations to treat UX HF as a main major thing, right? Major attribute.
So this will be sort of surprising, but the most successful projects that my firm has done over the last 50 years have resulted from the failure of others. So we find that human factors engineering gets integrated into product development processes most effectively when corporations have spent major money, ignored human factors, and have had catastrophic failures. For example, we designed the trading systems used on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. McKinsey and Booz Allen tried before, spent $100 million. IBM and HP spent $230 million, couldn't solve the problem. And it was after that they, as a last resort, frankly, they employed human factors engineering science. The second, way in which change takes place is market success. If a medical device would come to market that would be based on robust human factor science and prove to be extraordinarily successful, industry will take up on that.
Mhm.
It will follow. But I don't really see that happening, because what's happening in drug delivery is that we're reverting to basically 3 platforms: PFS, auto injectors, and on-body injectors. And there's the room for actual drug delivery device innovation is very narrow. Integrating robust human factors into those is sort of happening incrementally. And Shannon's question is very important.
Yeah. Well, I think that industry responds to competitive pressure and market pull. So hopefully we can see that. Guys, bad news, we have run out of time. So it goes so fast. I want to give Charles a couple of minutes to think about some key takeaway messages. And I want to share some announcements with you. First question I'm going to ask you, would you like me to have a more detailed, in-depth sit-down conversation with Charles, a little bit longer conversation with Charles? Please indicate in your comment, give it an upvote. Let me know what you think. And you can submit questions to me that I can ask him and we can go a little bit deeper. So I want to hear from you. Don't let this opportunity pass. But if I don't hear from you, I think it might be difficult for us to arrange that in the future. So the announcement I want to share with you guys is that I have launched a post-market safety surveillance workshop. It's a hands-on workshop where we go through a lot of examples and case studies, and we talk about regulatory requirements. We talk about data sources, analysis methods, advanced methods to detect signals early and make some decisions about those. And not only that, how and when to update your risk management file. Plus, we also talk about how to set up a very efficient operating process for your post-market surveillance that ties into your business goals with very easy governance. So if you're interested in that, reach out to me and I'll share more information with you. With that, Charles, I know we have run out of time, so I invite you to share just a few key points that we can take away.
Well, I guess possibly three takeaways. One is if you're actively involved in the design and development of a device for consumer applications with respect to drug delivery, do not rely only on the FDA guidance. You really need to go beyond the guidance and utilize professional human factors engineering methods to ensure the success of the product. Second is if you're looking to retain human factors expertise, make sure you hire folks who have a formal degree in human factors engineering or something very, very close, because there's so much confusion in the industry today with respect to what expertise is really required to solve these problems. And then I guess the third would be the world is changing in ways that I don't think any of us can predict sitting here today. And I think that, the arc of history favors human-centered design. Mm-hmm. And the more that you're committed to that on a philosophical level, the better it will be long-term for you and your company.
Excellent point. Thank you for sharing this with us, Charles. Really appreciate the time you have given us and the insights you have shared with us. Awesome, awesome conversation. Thank you, everybody, for joining today and such an engaging conversation. I loved your questions and comments. I look forward to seeing you once again next week. And a spoiler alert, I'm going to be talking to a lead auditor about applications of AI in the auditing space. The announcement has gone out. Please show up next Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern. With that, thanks, everybody, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.